Could you repeat the first question for me?
Of course. The question was when Jesus says in Matthew 13 that whoever has will be given more, how do you understand what it means to have? Is it primarily obedience, faith, humility, or something else? And why do you think so?
That refers to the message of heaven given to them. So if we hear the word of God and embrace it and live in obedience to it, God allows us to understand the deeper level of His word. However, if we disobey His word, then He will take away what we already have, meaning what we already understood will be taken away so that we will be led into destruction.
That's a really clear connection between obedience and understanding. So, as you think about that, do you see this principle at play in your own life or church community, where obedience to what we already know opens the door to deeper spiritual insights?
Yes, of course, I have seen many fellow Christians uh, who rejected the message of heaven, uh, and they all went to other church that falsely proclaims that a mere confession of faith alone is sufficient to enter heaven. And this is what Jesus meant to say in John chapter 6 verse 65. No one can come to me unless the Father enable them. And so no one can understand the message of heaven without the divine wisdom God provides.
That's a weighty observation. So, how do you think we practically help one another stay in that space of obedience rather than drifting toward complacency?
That's why it is essential for believers to stay rooted and stay rooted and firmly associate with a faithful Christian community that lives in obedience to the Word of God. Uh, by doing so, we can counsel one another, helping each other to stay on the right path of obedience and warning against acts of disobedience.
I love that emphasis on community. So, if we bring it back to you, what's one way you personally reflect daily or encourage others to ensure obedience stays genuine and not just a habit?
Uh, first and first and first and foremost, we must reflect on ourselves through the Ten Commandments, meaning we have to examine ourselves if we truly uh, truly practice the Ten Commandments in our life. In other words, we must check whether we are aligning ourselves with the Ten Commandments. Are we truly keeping the commandment? And that's the biblical lens through which we must be examined.
That's practical and grounded, using the commandments as a mirror. I love that. I think we're digging deep and we could keep at it, but that's a good reflection to carry. Let's hold each other accountable to that.
What the? So these are the improved version of the responses I have made earlier. This refers to the message of heaven that has been given to them. When we hear the Word of God, embrace it, and live in obedience to it, God allows us to understand His Word at a deeper level. However, if we disobey what we already received, God takes away even what we think we understand. In other words, the truth we once knew is withdrawn, and this ultimately leads a person toward spiritual destruction. Yes, I have seen this many times. I have known fellow Christians who rejected the message of heaven and moved to churches that falsely teach that a mere verbal confession of faith is enough to enter heaven. This is precisely what Jesus was addressing in John chapter 6 verse 65. No one can come to me unless the Father enables him. Without God's divine wisdom and enabling, no one can truly understand or accept the message of heaven. That's why it is essential for believers to remain rooted in a faithful Christian community that lives in obedience to the Word of God. Within such a community, we can counsel one another, encourage one another to stay on the path of obedience, and lovingly warn one another against disobedience. First and foremost, we must reflect on ourselves through the lens of the Ten Commandments. That means we must honestly examine whether we are truly practicing them in our daily lives. The key question is not whether we know the commandment, but whether we are actually living in alignment with them. This is the biblical standard by which we must examine ourselves.